Today we're going to take a look at what we've been doing the last 2 days with our parallel and perpendicular lines, and today we're going to put the two together. So it's going to be really important that you're paying attention to the directions, whether you need to be writing a line that's parallel or that you're writing a line that's perpendicular to each other. So let's just kind of refresh our memory. When we're talking about slopes of parallel lines are the same. So whenever you're asked to do something that's parallel, remember the slope has to be the same. And whenever you're asked to do something that's perpendicular, you want to think about that the slopes are opposite reciprocals. And I would say the biggest issue that students have is that they know that when they're working with parallel and perpendicular lines, one of the slopes needs to be the same, one of them needs to be opposite reciprocals, but they get the two confused. Here's how we remember to keep them straight. Parallel is a word that I think most of us are able to spell pretty easily. It's easy for us to say. Same thing with the word same. We all know how to spell it. It's easy for us to say. Perpendicular, on the other hand, that is a word that sometimes people struggle to spell because there's a lot of letters to it. Sometimes students have a hard time saying it because there's a lot of syllables to it. Same thing with reciprocals. That is a word sometimes students struggle to say. And I'll even admit, you'll notice that I wasn't talking when I was spelling the words reciprocals because I have to focus all of my attention on writing it because it's such a hard word for me to spell. So that's how I keep them keep them straight. Perpendicular is a hard word to spell along with reciprocals. So that's why these two match up with each other. Hopefully that helps. Otherwise, see if you can find another way to keep those straight. So we're going to take a look at first is, again, just like we've done the last 2 days, is we need to decide whether the lines are parallel or perpendicular. The last couple days you were just looking to see, are the lines parallel or are the lines just perpendicular? Now it could be either one. So you'll have to be paying attention to the slopes, like do the slopes end up being the same, so they're parallel, or do they end up being opposite reciprocals, so they're perpendicular? Here are the steps that we go through. Again, you want to make sure all of your equations are solved for y, so that way we can find the slope. Once they're solved for y, you want to identify the slope for each equation. Remember, the slope is in front of x. So whenever you're trying to find that slope, it's always going to be that number in front of x. Once you've decided, or once you've found the slope, I should say, then you need to decide if they're parallel. The slopes end up being the same, and they have to be exactly the same. Nothing can be different about them. Or are they perpendicular, opposite reciprocals, and they need to have both of them. They need to be opposites of each other, and they need to be flipped or reciprocals. Or they could be neither, meaning that they don't classify into either of those, either into parallel or perpendicular. I didn't give any of those to you today, but just know that that is always a possibility. You could have two lines that aren't parallel, or they're not perpendicular as well. So let's take a look at this first example. Notice both of these equations, they're not y equals. So in both cases, we need to solve them for y first. And you guys have done really well with this recently. Putting a line through our equal sign, circling our y and any number or sign that comes in front of it. Anything that's not circled, we add or subtract to the other side. So I'm going to minus x on both sides. Cross those out, and I'm left with a negative 2y equals a negative x. And I'm going to put that 1 in front of the x because I know that that 1 is written there. Again, mathematicians just got lazy with writing it. And the minus 4. Dividing by that number in front of the y. And remember to divide everything by that number. And we're left with y equals. Careful. A negative divided by a negative becomes a positive. Same thing, a negative 4 divided by a negative 2 becomes a positive 2. And I would leave your slopes as fractions because if they're perpendicular, we can't really decide that if you give them as a decimal if they're opposite reciprocals. So always leave your slope as a fraction. Now what's our slope from this line? Well, the number in front of x is a half. So my slope is a half. All right, that's helpful for us. Now let's see what happens in our other equation. If I work with this other one, line through my equal sign, circling my letter, or I'm circling my y, minusing the number that's not circled, and again that x has to come with it, and I'm left with y equals negative 2x minus 7. This one's kind of nice because there's not a number in front of our y at all, so we've already solved for y. Looking at this one, now that it's y equals, I can find my slope. And again, our slope is always that number in front of x. So for this one, my slope is negative 2. So let's think for a moment. Are these two slopes the same? Hopefully you're saying, Mrs. Haugen, that's crazy. These are not the same. So that means they're not parallel. Let's decide if they're opposite reciprocals. Well, this is kind of nice. This one's a positive, this one's a negative. So they're opposites of each other, but are they reciprocals? Well, if I were to flip this, that would become 2 over 1. And I'm just going to make note of that under here. If I were to flip this one, remember that there's that hidden 1 underneath of it. So if I were to flip that, that would be negative 1 over 2. If I take a look now, these two are flipped. So these are indeed opposite reciprocals, meaning that these two lines are perpendicular. And you don't need to explain anything else with them, just telling me that they are perpendicular. Let's look at this example. So again, neither one of these are solved for y, so we need to go ahead and do that first. So I'm going to put a line through my equal sign, circling my y, the number and the sign that come in front of it. Adding or subtracting what's not circled, because this is a positive 6, I'm going to minus, cross out, writing what was in my circle. And one thing I want to point out here, notice that this minus is with the 6, so notice that it's there as well. The 7 doesn't have a sign in front of it, so that means it's automatically a plus sign with it. Now we divide by negative 2. So we end up with y equals negative 6 divided by negative 2 ends up being a nice number, ends up being 3x. Plus, this one we can't divide, so we're just going to leave it as a fraction then of negative 7 over 2. Identifying my slope then. My slope comes in front of the letter x, so my slope is 3. Okay, so now we've identified the slope for the first one. Let's do it for my next one. Circling my y and the letter that comes in front of it, and there's nothing else on that side that I need to move over, so I don't need to add or subtract anything. So I'm going to go straight to dividing everything by 3. So I end up with y equals 9 divided by 3, again gives me a nice number of 3x. I can't take 1 divided by 3, and always remember, you always take the top divided by the bottom. So I'm just going to leave that as a fraction of negative 1/3. Identifying my slope. In front of x, my slope is 3. And now let's compare the two. Are these two slopes the same? And are they exactly the same? Yep, they are. So because they're exactly the same, these two lines are parallel. Now let's take a look where you're going to write equations just like we've been doing the last 2 days. But again, you're going to have to pay attention to the directions. The first couple are going to ask you to write lines that are parallel, and the last couple are going to ask you to write lines that are perpendicular. Here are the steps that we go through. still write down, and I think this is a step that a lot of you guys don't want to do, but it's going to be really helpful to make sure you get your answer. So I would write down y equals blank x plus blank, because we know we need to fill in these pieces. Now you want to find the slope for m. Make sure your equations are always solved for y. I'm going to give it to you that way, but know, like, as you move through your high school career, this step may not always be done for you. We want to find the slope. If we're writing lines that are parallel, know that we want the lines to be the same. If we say that we want the lines to be perpendicular, we want to use the opposite reciprocal. Plug in your m in your ordered pair so that way you can find that b value. And a big thing, write your new equation. This is the step that some of you guys forget. You tell me what b is, or you just tell me the slope, but you're not writing the new equation. All of your equations will end up like we have in step 1. Y equals a number, x plus a number. So when I look at your assignments, all of them should have something like this, but with numbers filled in those 2 spots. If not, it's an automatic redo. All right, let's take a look at this example. It says write an equation. Oh, let's stop here. Write an equation tells us that our answer is going to be y equals a number, x plus a number. Let's keep reading then. Write an equation that is parallel. Hold up. Parallel means the slopes are the same to the given line and goes through the given point. So let's take a look at the equation they give us. Let's first identify our slope. Our slope in that equation is 4. So the slope that I'm going to use when I write my new equation is also 4, because we said slopes are the same. Like we've done earlier this week, once we've pulled the slope from that equation, cross out that equation so it's not a distraction for you, because we don't need anything else from it. Now let's go through our process of writing our equation. Plugging in our slope, and now we're going to plug in our points. Y is 2, x is -2, and we solve for b. So we find that b is equal to 10, but I'm not done, because remember we said we're writing an equation. So now I have my slope, which is 4, and my b value, which is 10. So my answer is y equals 4x plus 10. So this is a line that's parallel to the original equation, but we're using a different point. For this one, I want you guys to go ahead and try this example. Again, I'm going to give you one hint. Remember your equation, or your answer, I should say. Y equals a number x plus a number. You guys go ahead and try this one, and when everyone's done, go ahead and press play again and see if we agree with the same answer. All right, hopefully you ended up with an answer of y equals 1/3 x plus 2. If you have any questions, take a look at the work that I have. Most students will make a mistake when they are taking 1/3 times 6. Again, use a calculator, and it's going to be easiest if you are using one of the scientific calculators to calculate that. Now let's take a look at this example. This one says write an equation. Oh, we need to write an equation. So I know my answer is y equals a number x plus a number. But this equation is perpendicular. What do we know about perpendicular lines? They are opposite reciprocals. So let's take a look at our equation. It has y equals 7x plus 1. So let's find our slope. our slope was 7, and I need to do the opposite reciprocal. So you know that that slope was positive. Now it's going to be negative. If I flip, remember there's that imaginary 1 underneath of it. So I flip it, and it becomes 1 over 7. So the slope that we're using is negative 1/7. And again, use it as a fraction. Things will get messy if you're starting to use it as a decimal. Let's cross out that original equation so it's not a distraction for us. And let's go through and find our b value. I plugged in my x and y. Always be careful. Make sure you're plugging the right value into the right spot. Again, use your calculator to figure out what is negative 1/7 times 14. Careful to make sure you still have that negative in there. So you end up with negative 2 plus b. Adding 2 to both sides. So we end up with b is equal to 6. Again, we're not done there. We plug in. Slope always comes first, followed by our b value of 6. So a line that's perpendicular to the original and goes through the given point is negative 1/7 x plus 6. Again, I want you guys to go ahead and try this example. See if you can work through it. What I want you guys to do is first figure out your new slope. Press play once everyone has their slope so we can check to make sure you guys have the correct slope. Then I want you guys to finish off with writing your equation. So just to check on this one, hopefully everyone ended up with a slope of negative 2. Remember, you have to change the sign. It was positive. Your new slope is going to be negative. And then make sure you flip it. And if you have the 1 underneath, so if you had negative 2 over 1, that's perfectly fine as well. I would never mark that wrong. So from this point, see if you guys can go ahead and write your equation. All right, so when you're all said and done, your perpendicular line should be y equals negative 2x plus 10. A big thing too that I forgot to mention in the last one is when you're writing your final equation, make sure you're using this new slope or the slope that you're finding. That's the slope that you use when you're writing your equation. And I forgot on mine to cross out that original. Because again, once you found your slope, we don't use that for anything. Take a look at my work. If you guys have any questions, see if you guys can figure out as a group. And then all set to work on this worksheet. So it's the 4.4 worksheet. Again, be very, very careful as you're doing the homework. Make sure you're reading the directions and finding parallel lines when you're asked to, and finding perpendicular lines when you are asked to.